Alzheimer's should be a rare disease.
We now understand that Alzheimer's is a preventable disease in the first place.
You are not stuck with the brain you have. You can make your brain better.
Hello, I'm Peggy Sarlin, and today I'm in Toronto, Canada, with Dr. Norman Doidge, the best-selling author of The Brain's Way of Healing and The Brain That Changes Itself. And these books have helped millions of people understand the concept of neuroplasticity, the ability of the brain to grow new cells and create new networks. And that turns out to be enormously important for healing very broad spectrum of problems, from learning disorders to traumatic brain injury, Parkinson's, and potentially Alzheimer's and dementia. And Dr. Doidge is a psychiatrist and a psychoanalyst with the University of Toronto and Columbia University in New York. And he has traveled the world to find new techniques to stimulate neuroplasticity in your brain. And this is really staggering stuff. It can create miracles, as you're going to hear. So welcome, Dr. Doidge.
It's great to be here.
So, Doctor, your books describe techniques that manipulate energy in the body to create neuroplasticity in the brain. So why don't we start out by understanding what neuroplasticity is?
Sure. It's a property of the brain that allows it to change its structure, its physical structure, and its function in response to mental experience and activity. So what you do, what you experience, what you think, even what you imagine can actually change your brain structure. And what we've been doing in the last while is using our understanding of plasticity to help people with various kinds of brain problems.
So when you say it changes the structure, if we're going to look at imagery of a brain, it's going to look different after you've done these techniques that we're going to describe today. The brain is actually physically going to change.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so that's exciting stuff.
At many different levels. In small parts of the brain, one can actually grow new cells. And it turns out that those small parts of the brain are actually relevant for Alzheimer's. Throughout the brain, through the rest of the brain, you can change the connectivity between the cells. So you can grow new connections or prune away various other connections to actually change the networks in the brain.
Well, you talked about small areas of the brain, so I'm assuming you're talking about the hippocampus,
Yes.
among others, because I think a lot of people who are watching know that the hippocampus is the place where Alzheimer's tends to begin. So we can use neuroplastic techniques to encourage new health, new cells in the hippocampus.
Yes, I mean, I want to emphasize that neuroplasticity isn't something we just use in the course of illness. Neuroplasticity is the modus operandi of the brain. And the reason that we're discovering it now is in part because we now have the technology to actually do microscopic movies and we can see the brain changing. But the brain's always been plastic, and everything you do in one way or another changes the structure of your brain. But we didn't appreciate that because the model people had of the brain for the last 400 years was that the brain was like a machine. What human beings have done to come to terms with the complexity of the brain over and over is to try to have some kind of metaphor for the brain. And so machines were very impressive to people 400 years ago, and so they started to talk about the brain as a hydraulic machine. And then when electricity developed, they started to talk about the brain as though it was an electrical machine, and we still speak of things like circuits in the brain. And now people are increasingly talking about it as though it's a computer. But that's wrong. The brain is not an inanimate machine, and machines do many glorious things, but they don't grow new parts when they're or new connectivities when they're damaged. So the machine metaphor has actually gotten in the way of our understanding of the brain, and we have to understand the brain in its own terms.
So understanding the brain in its own terms, this basic concept of neuroplasticity in terms of when we're dealing with a disorder, a brain disorder, or a brain problem, kind of works on the premise that if, let's say, the bridge is washed out on one part of the brain, that you can reroute and go elsewhere and get function back. Is that a proper way to say it?
Often you can, maybe not always, because when no two strokes are identical,
Yeah.
no two traumatic brain injuries are identical, and you need the ability to pay attention to make new circuits. But if you have that, you often can basically perform activities and get other brain areas to take over from the areas that have been damaged. So for instance, there's a fantastic treatment for stroke called constraint-induced therapy, where a person, if they have a stroke and they can't use their right hand, what a person will tend to do is increasingly use their left hand. It's a use it or lose it brain, and that may strengthen the circuitry that is governing the left hand. But in the meantime, the right hand, which is already damaged, will completely wither because it's a use it or lose it brain. So what they do in that treatment is they actually will take the hand you want to use, put it in a cast, so you can't use it, and then incrementally retrain the affected arm. And when they do brain scans on these people, what they find is areas in the brain adjacent to where there was the lesion or the cell death will take over, or sometimes areas in the opposite hemisphere, mirror areas in the opposite hemisphere, will start to process the activity so that this hand can move. It doesn't move quite as well as it originally did, but there are 500 studies now showing that that treatment is a powerful intervention. And that's a great example of neuroplasticity in action.
That's not a machine. If your dishwasher broke down, it could not reconstitute, could not totally change the way it works.
Not my dishwasher.
The way the brain you just described it. Many of these techniques that you write about involve manipulating energy in the body. And I think most of us who aren't doctors don't walk around thinking of our bodies as electrical systems, as energy units. And so can we start by understanding a little bit about that, how our brain is
Sure.
internally making energy?
Well, the brain does work, and that requires energy, and the brain actually uses about 20% of your energy consumption at least. So it's even though it's only several percentage of your body weight, perhaps. So it really punches above its weight in the consumption of energy. And for the last number of years, there's been a tremendous emphasis on brain chemistry, and people think of brain problems, and they think of advertisements that they've heard that tell them that depression is a chemical disease or Parkinson's is a chemical disease, and we focus very, very much on brain chemistry. And of course, there is brain chemistry, and it is important. But the way brain cells connect globally with each other is by electrical signals or spikes. So brain chemistry works, in between neurons. It works very locally and microscopically. But your brain works by transmitting signals, and from neuron to neuron and into the body and into your muscles so that they contract and so on. Now, one of the very neat things about the brain is that it has these windows to the outside world, which are sense organs. And our sense organs actually will take energy from the outside world and convert it into something electrical. So your eyes will take photons, and they convert it into electrical signals. Your ears will take sound waves and convert them into electrical signals in the brain. So what these sense organs are what are called in engineering, or even in biology, transducers. They take energy of one form and convert it into energy of another form. They also take patterns of energy of one form and convert it to patterns of energy in another form. So we're talking into microphones. They are transducers. They're taking sound waves and making it into an electrical signal, which then comes out of a speaker, which is also a transducer, which will take an electrical signal and make it into a sound wave. Now, our sense organs are transducers, and what we can do is we can use the energy patterns around us to sculpt the plastic brain if we know what we're doing. And so I didn't set out to emphasize energy, but after my first book, which tried to establish that neuroplasticity is clinically important and culturally important, and that culture shapes our brains, and that we can use plasticity for all sorts of medical purposes, I started to explore neuroplasticity throughout the world. And the theme that kept coming up over and over again was that people were finding that energy is a great pathway to non-invasively influence brain structure. I want to emphasize that. Non-invasively is important because invasive medical procedures have, a lot of potential risks. So we can now get inside the deepest part of the brain, for instance, through the tongue. By stimulating the tongue with certain electrical patterns, we can get into the brainstem. And the brainstem is a massive control center for the brain and the body, and we influence that. We can get into the brain and influence it with light and with sound, and even with movement if we know what we're doing. So it turns out that we tended to think of the brain as though it's buried deep inside your head, and the only way to get to it is either through drugs in the bloodstream, which are a very blunt instrument because they go through the entire body, or by cracking open a skull in surgery. What I emphasize is getting at the brain in the natural way, because really it's only in anatomy textbooks that your brain is cut off or separate from the body. In physiology textbooks and in reality, your brain is seamlessly connected to your body and your sense organs, which are seamlessly connected to the energy of the outside world. And so we can influence the brain in a very natural way, non-invasively, sometimes very remarkably.
That's very exciting stuff, and that's what we're going to get into. But just to return for a minute to the fact that you said there's been a lot of emphasis on brain chemistry, but now we're looking at brain energy. We're looking at the brain communicates through electrical signals, and is it generally a component if there's a brain disorder that there's an electrical problem, there's an energy problem going on in the brain? Is that a common component of a lot of brain dysfunction?
Well, it's important in a number. One of the things that I found that happens in many brain problems is that the signaling is irregular in some ways. People have heard of irregular signals when they think of heart problems. They know that there are arrhythmias. Sometimes the heart fires too quickly or too slowly or irregularly. Well, what I found as I started to review things is that there are many brain problems where the signaling is off, if you will, or it's asynchronous. And so it gives rise to what I call a noisy brain.
Did you make up that term?
Yeah.
The noisy brain.
Yes,
I like it.
Yeah. Okay. So let me give you an example. We used to think, for instance, that if a person, this is just one example among many, if they lost the use of their right hand in a stroke, and they lost 90% of the function of that hand, that 90% of the cells governing movement and sensation in that hand or the tracks leading from those cells to the hand must be damaged. But as I started to spend a lot of time looking at the electrical firing patterns in a number of conditions, what I found was this. Some cells are dead, but often cells adjacent to those dead cells are in some way metabolically compromised or sick. And sick cells don't necessarily fall silent completely. Rather, what they do is they may fire at the wrong rate. And then there are healthy cells that are connected to those sick cells, and they are getting irregular signals, and they can't use those signals. So you've got some dead cells, some sick cells which are of no use, and then healthy cells receiving junk data, and they'll send out junk data. And what we find is, if that's the case, what you can do is you can try to do something to help those sick cells, and you can also resynchronize the firing of the brain by all sorts of ways of influencing the brain, using energy patterns or things like neurofeedback, which is another technique you can use, to restore the normal firing, and suddenly someone who has had 90% loss of function might get a lot of that function back, because really only a few of the cells are dead, not nearly as many as we feared. And the other thing to keep in mind is there are so many cells in the brain that you actually can, if they're in certain places, can afford to lose some. We're all losing some. The most important thing is that the signaling is clear, that it's not noisy, which means that the signals that your brain makes can stand out against the background activity in the brain so that the signals are clear and sharp. So resynchronizing the noisy brain turns out to be a great way to improve the brain in a number of conditions.
Would Alzheimer's be one of them, do you think?
What I found as I started to explore so many different neuroplastic interventions was, well, here's how it came to me in practice. I wrote a book on the brain and how it could heal more than we thought, and then many people who had had traumatic brain injuries naturally contacted me, and I got more and more interested in that subject to see if injured brains could be helped. And the overwhelming majority of people with traumatic brain injury are told, they have a concussion or an injury, they go to the doctor, and they're told, you've got an 80% chance of recovering. And so some people do recover, but what about the 20% that don't recover? Well, they're told to rest and wait it out. And we really don't have very much in mainstream medicine for them, in fact, except, pray if they don't get better. And yet I was started to hear about all these different interventions. And suddenly there was an embarrassment of riches of different things that you could try for traumatic brain injury. And I tried to order it in my head, because people who've had traumatic brain injuries, they've typically they're unemployed, they're disabled. I mean, they don't have a lot of money. And so I tried to figure out, well, what intervention would be best for this particular person or that. And I realized that different interventions worked at different levels. And so I developed these 5 stages of neuroplastic healing. So the first phase is address general cellular health. In many brain problems, and Alzheimer's is definitely one of them, there are things that are going wrong in the cells. So that's always the first thing I would address. And even in traumatic brain injury, a few days after the injury, there's a lot of toxicity in the brain that's actually killing cells. Sometimes a person can be okay for a window, and then they actually get worse. So cellular health is always very important to address, and it's especially important in Alzheimer's. We could get back to that. The next, and the kinds of interventions, by the way, that deal with cellular health, light is one of them, hyperbaric oxygen is another one, making sure that the person doesn't have any mineral deficits, various kinds of deficits, getting rid of toxicities, dietary interventions. They actually are huge, because so many people are sensitive to so many things. Addressing the gut to get to the brain is another one, because if you have a leaky gut, then substances can trigger the immune system and get into the brain. So that's the first priority, cellular health. The next stage is what I call neurostimulation. So we've said it's a use it or lose it brain, and one of the things that happens in the brain is whenever there's any injury, one of the defenses is for that circuitry and the related circuitry to actually go dormant. That's a very common protective mechanism in biology. If something's not working, you don't want to be using up all of your energy, for instance, to do something that's not working. Imagine a circuit's noisy and not functioning properly. So dormancy is a huge thing that happens. So for instance, in stroke, when a person has a stroke, after the initial bleed or clot, the body has to reabsorb the blood, and there's a lot of chemical chaos in the brain after every stroke. Yeah. And so even if the stroke's in a small area, the chemical chaos kind of spreads through the brain, and the brain doesn't function all that well. And if you try to move your hand, it won't work properly. And so the brain, you keep trying and it doesn't work, and the brain learns that it's not working.
It's pointless.
And the circuitry actually goes dormant. That's called learned non-use. And people who have learned non-use just think that it must be brain damage, but actually some of it is actually learned. So knowing that there is learned non-use not only in stroke, but some degree in Parkinson's, you can get some of it in MS, what the clinicians got to do is find ways to stimulate that circuitry. And some of it can be exercise, some of it can be, there's many different ways we do it. Some of it can be with sound, some of it can be with neurofeedback, which is, again, it requires a whole explanation, but neurostimulation is the next thing I tend to address. Then I've already mentioned the noisy brain. So many conditions, not just epilepsy, parts of Parkinson's, sometimes stroke, learning disorders, autism, aspects of Alzheimer's probably, show brains that aren't firing synchronously properly. So the next thing to do is to resynchronize the firing. The next phase is something I call neurorelaxation. And it doesn't occur all the time, but one of the things I noticed with certain treatments, for instance, the sound treatments, sometimes the light treatments, sometimes the electrical stimulation on the tongue to resynchronize the brainstem, is patients would suddenly start sleeping for 16, 18 hours a day for a number of days. And I label that as a phase because that's when the brain is doing lots and lots of recovery. And you don't want to interrupt that sleep. You don't want to treat that sleep as though it's pathological. The final stage is neurodifferentiation. And that is a stage where the brain learns to make new distinctions. So I said it's a use it or lose it brain. Imagine you had a stroke. Or here's another example. Let's say a child was born spastic with cerebral palsy and they couldn't move their limbs.
Okay.
So one of the ways we actually form our brain maps is by movement. It's only, babies often, we know that they don't distinguish each of their fingers, and gradually they learn by moving them at different times to distinguish them. And as they move their fingers at different times, that's how the brain maps differentiate. So we know this from all sorts of brain scans, if you were to tape your fingers together and move them all together at the same time, you would not have a brain map for each individual finger. You would just have a map for this mitt. So kids with cerebral palsy don't even develop their brain maps properly, which means that if we could start moving their fingers, help them eliminate the spasticity, which sometimes we can, and move them differently, we can actually build up brain maps. Now, after a stroke or any brain problem where you're not using a function, the use it or lose it brain maps starts to de-differentiate. The distinctions, let's say, between the fingers, if that would be the example, start to blur, and you end up with a kind of club hand.
Right.
So one of the final things we do for any brain that's been injured is we redifferentiate things. And that can go for movements, speech, various forms of learning to differentiate body states. And neurodifferentiation is a really powerful thing. Even brain exercises, to some degree, can help with neurodifferentiation. But some of the various body work that people do develops neurodifferentiation.
Okay, so let's start going into some of the techniques that people might find that they can use on their family member. Light, you mentioned light. How is light going to rewire our brain?
Well, there's several steps to this story. At the basic level, all life and growth is dependent on light from the sun, either directly to us or to vegetables and fruits and things that we eat, which depend on light. Light is involved in the energy regulation of life. And in the early 60s, some discoveries were made about laser lights. Now, laser lights, when we hear that term, we often think of the power of light to destroy. You think of the James Bond movie and Goldfinger about to split
Right.
Mr. Bond in half.
Right.
Those are hot lasers. They burn flesh. But there are other kinds of laser lights, which are sometimes called cold lasers. They're not really cold. They're just not hot. And it was discovered by scientists that they actually can help healing. And they did experiments and they showed that animals that had wounds could be healed with these kinds of lasers, or in some of them hair could grow. And so people increasingly started to use these lights for biomechanical problems. And a lot of this was studied in Eastern Europe, although lasers were invented in North America, where they had less of an emphasis perhaps on chemicals and drugs. And they started shining light on things like E. coli, small organisms, and they found that light could do many, many things. And they found that light could actually help the production of DNA. It could lower inflammation in bodies. It could eliminate pain. And so people started using light for the body. And among those people who initially used light for the body, sometimes there's one case I describe where one of the physicians was using it for someone who had a neck injury in a car accident. So the physician put light on the back of his neck. That man also had had a stroke, which narrowed his field of vision. And in the course of his treatment for his sore neck, his field of vision, which was like a keyhole, started to expand. And the physician realized, my goodness, I'm also very, very close to the occipital cortex, the part of the brain that processes vision. Maybe light is actually helping vision. And a number of clinicians started increasingly using light for things like migraine headaches and ultimately for traumatic brain injuries. So what we believe is happening here is that there are certain specific frequencies that are in these lasers that promote healing and decrease inflammation. And also they influence the mitochondria, which are the sort of powerhouses in the cell. They produce the energy to re-energize. So the cell is extremely dependent on the mitochondria. It's like the power source in the cell to do its other work. And cells are always in the state of repair, and many of them in growth. So we now know, in fact, that light can be used to help a number of people with traumatic brain injury, for instance. And it's been used in some cases to help stroke as well, by, I think, helping the cells to get to the point where they can function again properly. And so it's a general cellular intervention, but it also leads to neurostimulation of those circuits.
You said one thing that light, and when we say, let's clarify, when we're talking about light here, we're talking about specifically about this cold laser.
Cold laser, but LED lights at the right frequency will also do it. What the lasers do compared to the typical LED lights is they can go deeper into the body, maybe 7, 10 centimeters deeper. You can also get the same effect with LED lights that are well tuned to these healing frequencies, but they don't go as deep into the body.
So we can shine a cold laser into the brain and cool down inflammation, right? Because inflammation is characteristic.
We can cool down pathological inflammation. That's the beauty of it. If your body is doing normal inflammation, that's a wonderful, welcome thing. But in many brain problems, I think of something like MS, aspects of Alzheimer's perhaps, but whenever there's been a bleed or a stroke, there often is a chronic inflammatory process which ends up being destructive. It's almost like inflammation starts and it doesn't go through to completion and it becomes chronic. And those are beautifully, or luckily anyway, that's the process that low intensity lasers and lights can push through to the end.
I should mention that Dr. Dale Bredesen, whom I recently interviewed, has divided Alzheimer's into 3 types. And the first type is inflammatory. The inflamed brain is characteristic of Alzheimer's. So having this non-pharmaceutical way to get deep into the brain and potentially cool down inflammation seems extremely promising. That's what it sounds like.
I would put it in the promising category.
In the promising category.
There are some studies that are ongoing now that are just starting up in Toronto. There were animal studies that were done in Australia that showed improvements in animals. If you're looking at rats and mice, you don't have very deep to go to get into the brain. So we have to see, basically. There were welcome changes pathologically in the brains of those animals, and they performed better after the lights. So we have to see if that will also work on human beings. But I do want to say, I believe that because the brain is complicated, I don't believe in the following statement, the following question. What is the appropriate treatment for brain condition X? As though there's one treatment and that matches a disorder. Let me explain why that is. You know, in medicine, there's low-hanging fruit and high-hanging fruit. And we've gotten a lot of the low-hanging fruit.
Right.
And low-hanging fruit are things like you have a snake bite, and there's one antidote for it, and if you give the person that, you get better. It's as though it's a kind of linear system,
Right.
and we know where there's a breakdown in the problem. In many of the conditions in medicine that are yet to be solved,
Right.
we're dealing with very, very complex problems with multiple reciprocal interactions, and each of them are different. Dr. Bredesen's shown that there are multiple paths, for instance, to Alzheimer's. So it stands to reason that there would be different approaches to each of them, and what we know from his work and what I find in my work is most people with a brain problem need multiple approaches. That's where the phases of neuroplastic healing may be helpful, because it tells us, are we addressing these various things? And so in Alzheimer's, we know there's many biochemical things going wrong. There's hormonal things, there's inflammatory problems, etc. And the light may play a role as being part of the protocol.
Where does somebody go if they're watching this and they say, "Oh, that sounds like it might be promising"? Where do they find somebody to treat their brain with cold
there are
lasers?
Again, what's happening in Toronto, in Boston, in Israel is, you know, a lot of it's fairly, you know, at a research level, but because lights in general are very, very safe. There are a few mistakes people can make with lights. It's not as, you know, there's some places where you shouldn't put them and so on, but because, you know, really many studies of lights, and you don't necessarily need lasers, you can do LEDs, make them very safe. It's possible to, I would always work with your physician, someone who knows you, but there are, in Toronto, Meditech is one place that has done a lot of work with light, not so much for dementia. I mean, they've done a lot of work with traumatic brain injury. Anita Saltmarsh is here in Toronto. She's done, she was part with Margaret Nazer of one of the very first studies, I think it is the first study actually, of head injury and light in human beings. So these are some people, and there's a manufacturer here in Toronto of something called Vielight, and people are trying that for a lot of brain problems.
Can you spell that for us?
I think it's VIELIGHT. So, I mean, there are several manufacturers. There are manufacturers throughout the world. You got to really check this out, because it's very easy to make cheap lights, sell them inexpensively, but they're not necessarily reliable. But they should certainly, for traumatic brain injury, you know, I would say work with someone who's got a lot of experience with it. And to begin with, make sure the diagnosis is correct, work with your own physician, and then in some cases, you might buy a home light, and after you've already seen an expert, and work with that.
Just to talk a little bit about light as medicine, you describe it in your book that Florence Nightingale discovered that when she brought soldiers out into the courtyard and they got sunshine, they got better than the soldiers who were patients inside the hospital. And so is this something we should keep in mind in general in terms of staying healthy or dealing with somebody who might be sick in some way? Is the capacity of sunlight to heal?
I think so. You know, the great problem with modern life is that science and technology has put us in all sorts of artificial conditions that we, you know, there's millions of years of evolution of animals that accustom them to being in a particular environment. And that environment included a lot of time spent in sunlight. And it's not just because sunlight is helpful with things like vitamin D. There are many reasons why sunlight is helpful. And yeah, we spend our time with artificial light. You know, the Florence Nightingale story is great because, as I recall, she was a nurse in the Crimean War, and it was just an observation she made that the patients who had wounds on the battlefield did better than people who were in various kinds of tents. And she had a tremendous impact on the design of hospitals in England and other places. So in the old days, they would design hospitals so everyone had access to natural light. With the discovery of the light bulb and Edison and so on, people assumed that the light bulb invention would have all of the key frequencies or components that natural light did. And so they eliminated, windows in hospitals
courtyards.
and all of that sort of stuff. And that was a huge mistake because artificial light, the typical artificial light doesn't have in it what natural light does. The other thing that happened was light was very frequently used as a treatment for things like tuberculosis and things like smallpox, as I recall. And there was a tremendous amount of pollution in places like Boston and London from coal production. And kids couldn't get better, and they would sometimes put them on boats and take them out so that they would get light to heal them, and people used to go to various places in the Alps for exposure to light for things like tuberculosis. It didn't always work, but it did work. With the development of antibiotics, people forgot about light as a therapy. And with people working very long hours inside, they forget about it in their everyday life. So look, you're in the doldrums, you're living in New York City, it's February, and I say, okay, I'm giving you a holiday in the Bahamas, and you feel good. Your cells start singing because they're telling you something, that you need that light.
We need light. So I think that's a good thing in general to keep in mind. We need light. Our bodies are designed to function well with sunlight. That we've done light. Let's talk about sound. How do you use sound interventions?
Well, let me take an extreme example of a very challenging situation. Let's talk about something like autism. But what I'm saying also applies to many learning disorders. Autism, again, is one of these complex disorders so that no two kids with autism are identical. And you have to address all the stages, in my opinion, of neuroplastic healing to get a chance at improvement. But this is something that's very well known. Kids with autism, the majority of them are actually hypersensitive to sound. So the scene of a kid, those very noisy walkways in airports, for instance, or escalators,
right,
or certain machine sounds, they really trouble those kids, and they're covering their ears all the time and often screaming. There's a number of sounds that really trouble those kids. And there's so many symptoms in autism that clinicians used to think, well, that's just part of the autistic package in many, many kids, but it couldn't be all that important. Well, it turns out it's actually really important, sound sensitivities. So when you walk into a party, and there are a lot of people there, it's kind of booming, buzzing confusion, and there's just kind of a rumble, you can't make it out. But over time, you start to focus on individual conversations. There's some people are talking about religion here, and politics here, and romance here. What's happening is, just as in a camera there's a zoom lens, in your ear there's like an auditory zoom that can focus in on the frequencies of human speech. And in autistic kids, many of them with sound sensitivities, or in kids with sensory integration disorder, or in kids with auditory processing disorders, that auditory zoom is often not working very well. Now that's really important for the following reason. For human beings, in fact, for all animals, there are certain frequencies that we communicate with other human beings, and in those frequencies most people are pretty comfortable with. We evolved to be comfortable in those frequencies, the frequencies of human speech. But there are other frequencies. Those are sounds that, for instance, predators, animals that kill us make, and those make us very anxious for fight or flight reasons. We don't want animals that prey on us to be able to hear our communication frequencies, and we are really sensitive to the sounds that they make. Now, if you think about going to the movies, and if there's a monster coming on the screen, if there's an alien on the screen, if there's a shark, the music is always very, very low. When it's just very, very frightening to hear that low sounding. If a person is possessed by an alien, you'll forgive me, but and it's some very low, frightening sound. Now, autistic kids are not hearing human speech sounds, which are calming to us. They are often hearing sounds which are very threatening. And so they're covering their ears to block out the sound, but also to try to regulate their fear and their terror. That's really, really important to understand. So a French doctor named Alfred Tomatis made a series of discoveries, and one of them was that you could actually train up an auditory zoom by taking certain kinds of music and modifying it so that at times you're triggering something they're comfortable with and something they're uncomfortable with. And so this is now one of the part of the package of treatment for autism, and it's not widely known, but I have definitely seen cases of autistic children who are severe go to becoming mild, and occasionally, not always, but at times, seen kids who are significantly autistic fall off the spectrum. And there are cases of kids who are autistic who do fall off the spectrum, and there is not, most parents are told autism is genetic, there's nothing you can do about it, be mature as a parent and adapt to it. But there are more and more cases, histories of people who are very well diagnosed, who with different kinds of interventions make significant improvements and occasionally even fall off the spectrum. And so what happens is, in these situations, is the kid will come to a place called the Listening Center. That's one of the places that does this in North America, the one that I've studied the most. And they'll start listening to modified music. They tend to work with Mozart, perhaps because there's a number of reasons for that, but it's higher frequencies that are kind of lay the groundwork for human speech, and then they fiddle with it, they modify the music. And as they start to develop the auditory zoom, and sometimes it can happen in several days, kids will do amazing things. They will turn to their father for the first time and hug him. And their speech will improve, and they lose their sound sensitivities. So, what's happening here is the following. It's complicated, but it's really important to know. When you're in fight or flight, you really turn off what's called the social engagement system. The social engagement system is that system that allows us to modulate our speech, to look people in the eye, to hear the frequencies of human speech, amongst other things. If you want to connect with people, all of those things have to be done. And the ear and the brainstem, if you're constantly in fight or flight because of the sound, you will turn off the social engagement system. This is such an important fact because some people will say that the essence of autism is the inability to model other minds. And if that's the case, how is it possible that a kid listening to music can, within several days, suddenly express love for the parent? What that tells us is they had that capacity. And by the way, some parents sense that. They had that capacity, but it was constantly being turned off because they were in fight or flight because of the ear problem. And you can use this to help kids with with attention problems. Some attention problems are actually listening problems and auditory processing problems. You can use it for a range of problems. There are patients I've seen who had traumatic brain injury. By the way, they often will get hypersensitivity to sound. And sound can be an important component of their treatment. And there are other things you can do with sound too. But again, what's happening here? We're using patterns of information contained in energy to modify the brain circuitry and resculpt it, build new processors in some ways, silence the noisy brain so that the brain can function at capacity.
So this is a great example of using energy to promote neuroplasticity because you're not giving anybody a pill, it's not a pharmaceutical drug. You're having them listen to music or sounds in ways that are going to enable them to activate their auditory zoom. To turn off is like they're not hearing the soundtrack of Jaws going in their mind all the time.
Or very frequently, yeah.
Right, so that I can't focus on you, I'm too busy being scared about this impending shark.
And not even understanding why I'm so scared, which is also disorienting and even frightening.
Right, just your heart.
And why is
pounding.
nobody else scared? Why am I scared? There's so many things that those children are going through. And you see, there are there are some medications we have in medicine that actually go in there and fix a problem, like an antibiotic when it's working and used appropriately and not overused.
Right.
But most of the medications in psychiatry and neurology don't fix the problem. They're not even designed to fix the problem. The model that people have is the system is broken, the brain is broken. You hear that phrase. It's a machine and it's broken. And so what we're doing is we have a medication that props up the failing system. But stop the medication, forget your dose, and the symptoms and the problem returns. What's beautiful about this kind of intervention is you're actually training the brain. And once they get it properly differentiated, there is an element of neurodifferentiation in their auditory cortex with this kind of training. And they learn to properly modulate or neuromodulate their emotions because their fight-flight system isn't always being turned on inappropriately. It's not as though they have to walk around listening to music all day long. Like, the therapy is typically something like 15 days. And then you might wait for a number of months and then do another session, and maybe once a year for a few years. But basically, that's it. It's in those cases, I don't even want to say the problem is fixed because that's kind of a machine metaphor.
Right.
Their brain grows out of the problem, or it accesses its potential, or it heals itself. And I think healing is an appropriate word here. You know, healing comes from an Old English word, and it really means to make whole again. And I think that's what's happening there.
So we've got sound, we've got light, and another recommendation you have in the book that you discuss is the possibility of online programming to activate certain brain patterns to encourage new neuroplasticity, I guess, in positive ways. Tell us about, are there programs you recommend? Who is it appropriate for?
It really does come down to which programs are well studied. You know, often one reads in the papers these headlines, brain exercises or usually they'll say something like brain games of no use. And these are based on studies which I must say are deeply problematic, because what they do is they put together apples and oranges and figs and spoiled apples and spoiled figs. They just lump them all together. Anything that has to do with the brain and some kind of computer is called a brain game or exercise. And people and many people have, once plasticity became discovered, started throwing the word around and rebranding old-fashioned kinds of brain games as though they were effective. And they're not all equal. And right. So the ones that I've studied closely, and I have no financial involvement with this in any way, but I happened to be there when the company was, two people in a living room, is the Brain HQ exercises. And one of the people in the living room was arguably one of the leading scientists in the world, was Michael Merzenich, who had done so much to persuade skeptical scientists that the brain is plastic. And he was interested in neurological and psychiatric problems. And so he was a prof in San Francisco, and there's now over 150 studies, good studies, that show that Brain HQ is helpful for age-related cognitive decline and many other brain problems. And the first thing, whenever you talk about brain exercises, people say, okay, great, so you can get good at the brain exercise, but does it generalize? Yes, it does generalize. It generalizes to everyday life. For instance, they've got a visual brain exercise, which in a number of studies has shown that if you give it to elderly people, they have fewer car accidents. Wow. They can process things happening in real time much faster. That is generalization. And they followed many people, for instance, who were elderly in a hugely expensive study sponsored by NIH at many different hospitals, and showed that they were better in managing, elderly people who did the exercises were better in managing everyday life. And so brain exercises like this work by, I believe, stimulating pathways and neurodifferentiation. But this has been put together by a team of neuroscientists. It's not the same as some person just doing an app with a game. And so, they're being studied all over the world now. In Toronto, they're being studied for traumatic brain injury. And traumatic brain injury, again, is no two injuries are the same. So in some cases, I don't recommend brain exercises for traumatic brain injury. I'll recommend addressing other things first, and then later I will suggest brain exercises. But early on, a person might just get a headache. You got to address some of the cellular things that are happening, I believe, first, and then you can get into neural stimulation.
So if we're not dealing with traumatic brain injury, but we're dealing with just age-related cognitive decline, senior moments, or maybe even the beginning of Alzheimer's, this kind of brain exercise could be beneficial.
Well, let's differentiate those two. Age-related cognitive decline. So it's a use it or lose it brain. And as most of us hit middle age, we go to a party and we're introduced to 3 people and we swear we're going to remember their names and we just can't hold on to it. And increasingly, we find ourselves in a room and say, why did I just come into this room? Now, people get very frightened that that might be Alzheimer's, but most of the time, it's actually age-related cognitive decline. And that's because middle age is most people in middle age are probably in the same job or career that they've had. They might be living in the same town. They might even have the same spouse if they're lucky or unlucky, and so on. So there's not nearly the novelty and demand placed on the brain that we had when we were in high school and doing a final exam or university, okay? For the brain to maintain itself, just like the heart, to maintain your heart, you want to do some interval training, or you really want to work up a sweat and challenge it from time to time. Walking is fantastic, but to really get in tip-top shape, you've got to do some exertion. And the same goes for the brain. You can't spend a lifetime replaying mastered skills, or you can't spend 30 years of middle age replaying mastered skills and expect to maintain your brain function. So what it's been shown persuasively is that people who are, let's say, 70, who have age-related cognitive decline and do these brain exercises can start to function the way they did when they were 60 or younger.
Wow.
Maybe even 55, maybe even younger in some cases. And that it generalizes. So something like Brain HQ is definitely very helpful for maintaining brain function. And it's just so important that you investigate the research backing of not brain exercises, but the specific ones you're committing to, because you're putting a lot of time into it. Now, as for the issue of Alzheimer's, there was a poster. The study isn't yet published of using it. They reanalyzed that NIH data I spoke about, and they found that there was a decreased onset in the poster. So it hasn't gone through the full peer review process. But it was done by the same team that did a 10-year plus study of brain exercises. So I don't want to say that brain exercises are part of the package for Alzheimer's based on science. I think based on prudence, if one was addressing the cellular health the way Dr. Bredesen does, that it does make sense to have that as part of a package. But we're going to see very soon. My guess is the following, that because there are different kinds or different pathways to Alzheimer's, it may be helpful for some if the general cellular health is being addressed, but maybe not for others.
Well, you make this point again and again in the book. No two brains are the same, no two experiences, and it's really individually tailored, the therapy that works. So you have to, trial and error is probably part of it. Can you give us just a quick tour, because I know we have to wrap up now, just a sense of some of the other possibilities of, we've got sound and light and cognitive exercises. You mentioned the tongue as a road into the brain.
Sure.
And maybe some other ones in your book. You talk about cranial stimulation, neurofeedback. If you could just give us like a quick overview of some other interventions we could try.
Well, as I said, I've definitely seen patients get better on tongue stimulation. And again, it doesn't work for everybody all the time, but It was kind of discovered by accident, basically. A lab that I followed since 2003 in the work of Dr. Paul Bach-y-Rita was trying to develop a prosthetic device for people who had balance problems originally. So some people can have balance problems are very common, but there was, for instance, a woman patient that I got to know, Cheryl Schultz. She had an antibiotic after a hysterectomy that basically damaged her inner ear, and she completely lost her balance. So the idea of this device was, there was a plastic strip about the size of a piece of chewing gum that had, I think, 144 little electrical stimulators on it. She'd put it on her tongue, and it would be fixed up to a small computer and a hat with an accelerometer, which is kind of like a gyroscope. It tells you where you are in space. She'd lean forward, and because she had no input for balance from her ears, she would feel the electrical stimulation on her tongue kind of like roll forward. It felt like champagne bubbles. And the champagne bubbles would roll forward, telling her she was in the forward position. You go to the side, the champagne bubbles go to the side. Anyway, to make a long story short, that worked magnificently well. But she also found, after she took the hat off, that the ability to orient in space, even without the device, would last for a few seconds. And so she kept using it, and that residual period of normal orientation lasted longer and longer and longer. This is a woman who'd lost 97.5% of her ability to orient in space. And eventually she didn't even need the hat. So a lot of us were thinking about what is happening to this woman. And one of the things was that her brain was developing new pathways or new connections to in that 2.5% that was left, that was taking over a balance function. So the next thing that happened is the lab said, well, let's do an advertisement for people with balance problems. And so she had a unique balance, a very rare balance condition. So people with balance problems came to the lab, and they put this device on. People with Parkinson's have balance problems. People with stroke have balance problems. Right. MS have balance problems. TBI have balance problems. There's a lot of conditions with balance problems. And so their balance improved. But something else happened that was never anticipated. People with Parkinson's felt less rigid. That wasn't supposed to happen. Mood often goes in Parkinson's. Their mood improved. Same with stroke. People with stroke came in, their balance improved, but maybe their coordination improved. This didn't make any sense. They were working on a model that they were just addressing balance issues. And then someone in the lab figured out maybe it's the electrical stimulation on the tongue, which is going directly to the brainstem, which is having a generalized resetting effect on what I would call a noisy brain in the brainstem. So now it's being studied for TBI and other things. So I said it was an accidental discovery. Those are we think about what I would call consumer science. We're going to get, the president says, let's get a man on the moon.
Man on the moon.
Man on the moon. You just tell them what to, okay? Or let's solve the AIDS problem. Those are two brilliant examples of what I would call consumer science. But that's not the way most science works most of the time. Most of the time, we don't understand something, but the scientist is very well educated, and something happens that's not supposed to happen. And then the alert scientist says, obviously, my knowledge is very limited. I have to rethink things based on this thing. And so you repeat it to make sure it's a real phenomenon, and then you start thinking. And so what they realized was that there were many things that were happening in that brainstem area that were being addressed by this technique. And now it's being studied for a number of things, particularly MS, stroke. It's been used at times for Parkinson's and helps some people, and traumatic brain injury. And so that's a great way to non-invasively sculpt the brain and make use of its plasticity using a kind of energy-based intervention. Now, I've mentioned neurofeedback a few times. So neurofeedback's been around a long time. The problem with neurofeedback was that people were making all sorts of claims that didn't make sense to people who had the model of the brain as a machine. Mm-hmm. You'd be watching, basically what happens is this. Neurofeedback in the typical delivery system now would involve having some kind of EEG, a partial EEG, feeding signals into a computer, and then to a computer interface. So I'll give you, and neurofeedback is an evidence-based treatment for certain kinds of epilepsy and ADD. What that means is you train your brain and then you don't need to take medication, period, for if you've got that kind of ADD. So many kids with ADD, the teacher says, "Johnny, are you listening or are you asleep?" And actually, part of Johnny's brain is asleep. That's what's happening. In a lot of kids with ADD, there are brain waves that most of us as adults or teenagers have as we're falling to sleep that are, have a much higher representation in Johnny's brain. There are other brain waves that most of us have when we're in a calm focus that are underrepresented in Johnny's brain. So what you do is you wire Johnny up and you find out which brain waves he's firing at any given time. And even Johnny sometimes will, even though he doesn't do it very much, will fire those brain waves that have to do with a calm focus. And the computer picks that up, and you might set up a game where there's 3 boats. And when he's in a state of really calm focus, his boat, the middle boat, surges ahead of the other 2 boats. And you just tell Johnny this: watch the game, and just know that it's really good when your boat wins. So it's set up so that when he has calm focus waves, he gets a feedback signal. That's good, keep doing that, keep doing that. And when he has fewer of the sleep waves, or sleep-like waves, his boat surges even further ahead. Now, it's remarkable, but so much of what we do is unconscious. But all you have to do is just tell Johnny it's good when your boat wins. And over time, maybe typically 40 training sessions, what will happen is he will learn how to shift himself into calm focus when he has to and not be sleepy in class. And this is without medication. And so it's a spectacular treatment. It's underutilized. And that's just one use you can do for neurofeedback. It's been helpful in some kinds of epilepsy. It's also been used in some learning disorders. Sometimes 2 parts of the brain that should be talking to each other are not in a person. And so what you can do is you can set the game up so that on the rare instances when they do accidentally shake hands, the boat goes ahead. And so you train that over 40 to 60 sessions. And now you can get 2 parts of the brain that for whatever reason weren't talking. So there's many potential uses of neurofeedback. And again, non-invasive. And it's not propping up a failing system. It's training the brain to do what originally it ought to have done.
So thank you so much, Dr. Deutsch, for sharing with us today your really unique insights into how we can use neuroplasticity to unleash the brain's own capacity to heal, and all kinds of conditions that aren't being successfully addressed now through other means, and without taking a drug, using light, sound, tongue stimulation, really new stuff. So thank you. And thank you for watching. I hope you were as excited as I was to learn about these really new approaches that have the potential to heal such difficult and challenging conditions. And so I hope you found it of value. Thank you for watching. Hi, I'm Peggy Sarlin, and these days in brain health, you really can't get more cutting edge than Dr. Deutsch. He shared some amazing insights with us. And tomorrow you'll see even more insights from a practitioner who's dealing every day with patients and turning their lives around. Her name is Dr. Shari Kaplan, and she has an impressive clinic called Vitality MD in Toronto, Canada. And as a special treat, I filmed interviews with several of her patients so you can learn and profit from their experiences. Dr. Kaplan received her medical degree at the very young age of 24, and these days, in addition to her private practice, she's a lecturer at the University of Toronto. Like many of the doctors I spoke with, Dr. Kaplan became a convert to functional medicine because she found out the conventional approach wasn't working for her own health problems or for those of her patients. And now she's an expert, and the patients that I talk to prove it. And let me tempt you with 2 big takeaways from this coming interview. Now that you can get your genome mapped for a low price, your doctor can go to town with this information in ways you really won't believe. Dr. Kaplan explains it. For one thing, some of us are poor detoxifiers because of our genes. We have a genetic problem detoxifying. And if that's true for you, you need to take a step beyond the usual detox protocols. Also, some of us have a genetic problem absorbing certain nutrients, and if the doctor knows that, she can correct it. And another big takeaway is if you're overweight, if you got a problem with your weight, very well may not be your fault. Dr. Kaplan reveals 2 big factors that cause us to put on the pounds, and they have nothing to do with overeating or with failing to do exercise. She explains how you can do everything right and still have a gut hanging over your belt. And lucky for us, you can fix these things. And I'll add a PS. When you correct these 2 issues, your health will improve in at least half a dozen other ways, and your risk of memory loss and dementia will plummet. Dr. Kaplan's interview goes up at 9 a.m. Eastern tomorrow, and you'll get the link in your morning email. But there's something else we're giving you, a second Regain Your Brain interview tomorrow, so there's 2 in one day. The other interview is with Dr. Jacob Teitelbaum, one of the stars from our first series. I love Dr. Teitelbaum. Dr. Teitelbaum is one of the doctors who first opened my eyes 7 years ago to the fact that you can reverse Alzheimer's disease. And back then, almost nobody was saying this. He was way ahead of his time. Tomorrow, he reveals his 5-part SHINE protocol to improve your brain health yourself at home by tackling sleep, nutrition, hormones, infections, and exercise. He gives us a wealth of tips and advice, and he says 80 is the new 50. Don't you love that? You're going to see why. Check your emails at 9 a.m. Eastern tomorrow for links to both interviews. I'll see you then.
Please consider supporting our important mission by choosing to own a copy of Regain Your Brain for yourself. You'll receive all the valuable therapies in the interviews and many more additional gifts and benefits. Your purchase will help us continue to bring this vital, important information to more people. Just click on one of the banners below and join us in our mission.